the capital of Czechoslovakia, was something of a cultural and political oasis before the war. In the late 1930s, it was also the capital of the only democracy in Central Europe. Father was a prosperous young lawyer there. Life was pleasant in the vibrant pre-war Czechoslovakia. There was a pretty wife, 2 healthy sons. Father dabbling in journalism and art. We lived in the old section of town, in a cozy apartment. There seemed to be no end to happiness in surroundings like these. In 1938, with Nazis all around, the Czechs prepared their defenses. Father reported to his military unit, and the whole nation held its breath. But the fortifications were never used. The West abandoned its Czechoslovak ally and signed the Munich Agreement with Hitler. 6 months later, the Germans marched into Prague. Prague became the capital of a Nazi protectorate whose government was fully under German control. Father joined the underground, which soon established secret radio contact with London. There was much to report. Hitler ordered the destruction of unwanted minorities, starting with the Jews, and placed Himmler in charge. Entrusted with the liquidation of Czech resistance was Reinhard Heydrich. In January 1943, Father was arrested and sent to Auschwitz. He was not Jewish, but his documents were still stamped, "Return unwanted." Father's return to Auschwitz came 40 years after he had been a prisoner there. This time as a free man, arriving from a free country in the West. He came to remember, and I to learn. Father knew the terrible place only too well. I came for the first time. Today, Auschwitz is visited mainly by those who were not even born during the war. In 5 languages, people are asked to maintain a respect for silence. Only the guides speak. Father didn't need a guide. He walked into the camp alone. At first, it wasn't easy to get him to talk, but once he began, the memories became more vivid, the need to tell greater.
On the 5th day out of Prague, our transport came to a slow stop. Some of us saw the sign on the station building. It was Auschwitz. Right next to us, they were unloading a transport that came from somewhere in the east. These people were going straight into the gas chambers. A bit to the side, some members of the SS with horsewhips in their hands were watching the whole show. We had some among us who weren't fit for work. For example, there was a hunchback. The SS officer pointed at him with his whip. They loaded him up on a truck, and we never saw him again. Then they took the Jews away, probably straight to gas chambers.
A prisoner's possessions, clothes, even his name were quickly taken away. He became a number, then was put into a stall. Little remained of his humanity. Thousands of tons had been for years shipped from Auschwitz to Germany, but the liberating Russians still discovered mounds of eyeglasses, shoes, teeth, dental instruments, various kinds of brushes, and human hair. To this day, they constitute a silent witness to Nazi inhumanity at the Auschwitz Museum. All were made use of by the Third Reich. Even gold teeth were melted down for the Reichsbank in Berlin. Millions arrived here, but only a handful left.
We walked silently. Most of us were thinking about death.
The sign says that work brings freedom, but work killed the emaciated prisoners, usually within days. A new camp was built when Himmler announced that Auschwitz would have to hold more than 100,000 people. This became the dreaded Auschwitz-Birkenau. High voltage wire surrounded the camp. Prisoners sometimes tried to commit suicide by running into it. The lucky ones made it. Others were shot before they reached the wire.
They stood us up in rows for a roll call. We watched the thousands of prisoners coming back from work, carrying their dead hung on long poles. I found that as humans, we fight to the very last moment, the very thought that we might lose our lives. Then they tattooed numbers on our arms. I got number 94,692. Then they herded us into a building that had once been a stable. That night we got our first food. It was soup made out of nettles, but it was hot, and that was important. From far away, we heard the barking of dogs and constant shooting. But at that moment, we still had no idea that they were shooting at live targets. A little over a week in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and quite a few of us who came on the same transport were already gone. At Birkenau, I walked around bodies that were lying in the mud like pieces of wood. Later on at Block 11, where they carried out the executions, I actually waded in blood. I also lived through a spotted typhus epidemic. But those of us who survived all this felt as if it really doesn't concern us, as if it concerned someone else, someone less lucky. I did my best not to hear and not to see death. Death became for us about as bothersome as an upset stomach or mosquitoes. I think that I would be quite upset to hear myself talk the way I talked then. But we really had only two choices. Either to cover ourselves by a shell of cynicism, maybe even brutality, or to die. The fight for bare life is a hard test for a man's character. And then, on the 6th of February in 1943, we were once more standing at roll call when they called out my number. Now, that could have meant anything. So it was with mixed emotions that I ran up to the capo. But he didn't kick me or hit, quite the opposite. He was actually very servile. I even got a new uniform, and an SS guard picked me up at the gate. Walking those 2 miles to the main camp, I'll never forget. I had the feeling that I was returning from the grave. In the main camp, the quarantine was block number 11. Number 11 was a block full of hope, as well as a place housing the most terrible torture chambers. In the courtyard, there were 2 gallows and a wall. Prisoners were shot while kneeling, naked, by a bullet into the back of their necks. During executions, we were herded to the opposite side of the block, but later, when we walked out into the courtyard, the ground was still soaked with blood. It was maybe even worse across the courtyard, behind windows that were always boarded up, where they experimented on women. We used to hear such pitiful children's cries from there. In the end, they always killed them. We were still beaten and sometimes pretty cruelly punished on the quarantine, but death was less certain here. Then one day they called out my number once again. I got my fur coat plus a good supply of food and tobacco. Auschwitz was generous to those who survived it. Everything which came after I walked out through the gate of Birkenau had been given to me as a special gift. But why me?
Only God knows for certain. Part of the answer lies in the capture of the leader of Father's underground group. The Gestapo now needed Father back in Prague. Working skillfully and feverishly through loyal Czech officials and corruptible Gestapo men, who had already lost faith in the Third Reich and were hoping to survive after the war, Mother and his friends eventually saved Father's life.
After the war, I returned to Auschwitz. That was in the spring of 1947. In Warsaw, I had testified at the trial of Rudolf Hess.
At that time, father was the chief prosecutor of a Czechoslovak war crimes tribunal. Except for a few months, Rudolf Hess was the commandant of Auschwitz from 1940 until the very end. At Auschwitz, Hess lived in a villa which Himmler thought too modest for the rank of camp commandant. But Hess's delighted wife ran a lavish household here, with the help of supplies stolen from the camp's commissary, and declared that this was where she wanted to live until she died. Here also, Hess's sons played Camp Commander, a game which usually ended with one sending the other to the crematorium. In 1947, Hess was hanged at Auschwitz, not far from the crematorium and from his former villa. The gallows, built specifically for him, still stands on the spot. In 1942, the first transport arrived for the gas chambers, and Auschwitz truly became a Vernichtungslager, a death camp. But Vernichtung means more than death. It means making something into nothing. It means annihilation. The crematoria could handle 9,000 bodies in 24 hours, most of them Jewish. When the gates were finally flung open, less than 8,000 prisoners remained. About 50,000 others had been marched off to Germany. Children arriving at Auschwitz went straight into gas chambers, but 180 of them were liberated by the Russians. Many of them were twins. SS Dr. Josef Mengele liked to experiment on them. No effort had been spared by the retreating Germans to obliterate their crimes. All but one of the gas chambers and crematoria had been destroyed.
Four decades changed the face of Birkenau too. The wooden barrack in which I lived is gone. Its chimney still stands against the sky like a warning finger. But the terrible memories, I don't think they will ever disappear.
There are a few places with a railway spur leading to nowhere, and there are many places with meaningful memorials. But there is only one small area on this planet where perhaps as many as 4 million people perished.